University and Heinrich Boll Stiftung, whose director Irene Canfin is right here. Let me welcome you at the premises of the most international university in Poland. We've got Europe. We need Europeans. As my former mentor Bronisław Geremek used to say, not long time ago, the EU was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. It's the most successful integration project over centuries. But today, there are many people in Europe and elsewhere who question not only the direction of European integration, but the underlying sense of it. Indeed, the EU is hit on many fronts by a profound, continuous crisis. More than a decade ago, I had one of the most glorious days in my life. It was when Poland entered the European Union. We sat on the day. Some call it Europe, we call it home. It's time now to rebuild and reconstruct the house. What's the future of Europe and the state of the Union? These are the questions that we want to ask to our distinguished panelists. Andrew Moravcsik is a professor of Princeton University, professor of politics, and director of the European Union Studies program at Princeton. He is one of top scholars in international relations and EU affairs. He's author of more than 125 publications. Professor Moravcsik is regular commentator for Foreign Affairs, Newsweek International, Financial Times, and New York Times. He is non-resident fellow at Brookings in Washington, D.C., and currently a senior fellow at the Transatlantic Academy, also in Washington, D.C. Professor Moravcsik, welcome to Poland. Our next speaker, Dr. Paola Sobacki, is research director at the Royal Institute of International Affairs called Chatham House in London. Dr. Sobacki has written extensively on international economics and is visiting professor also at the Bologna University. She is BBC, Financial Times, and Project Syndicate commentator, and also she cooperates with Economist Intelligence Unit. Dr. Sobacki, welcome to Poland also. I must say, both Andy and Paola are for the first time in Poland, so really, thank you. Dr. Andrzej Olechowski is very well known here at Vistula University because he lectures here. He is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Finance. He holds a PhD from economics and worked also for the World Bank. He set up the civic platform that is governing in Poland today, and he was also candidate in the presidential election of 2000. Minister Olechowski, welcome. And before we start, let me ask a very special person who is a friend of Europe and who contributes in practice to make Europe a better place. His name is Henryka Mościcka-Dendys, and she is Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Madam Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This was probably the kindest invitation to speak I've ever heard, so may I get it in written form, please? Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, distinguished professors, dear colleagues, friends of Europe, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to address you from this very place, and it's a pleasure to see many of my masters sitting in the audience. I'm pleased to see so many of Poland's distinguished ambassadors around, and it's really an honor to see you here. And I also am pleased to see colleagues from the diplomatic corps with whom I'm working on a daily basis. The subject of our today's discussion, the future of Europe, is both an ambitious one, but in the midst of running daily businesses, I think also a very important one to discuss, because we need to take a broader look at some of the consequences of the actions we're taking on a daily basis, or the lack of actions, not just in the short term, but also in the mid or even longer term. In other words, we need to become more strategic, or we as the EU shall fail, simple as that. So how should EU act, and what should we do? I therefore look forward to listening to the thoughts and perhaps the recommendations for actions which will come from the eminent speakers here on the podium, Professor Andrew Moravczyk from the Princeton University and Dr. Paola Subaci from the Chatham House. I'm also privileged to speak in the presence of Dr. Andrzej Olechowski, whose name will definitely go down in Polish history textbooks among various other accomplishments. He was the one who, as the Polish foreign minister, personally delivered the application of Poland for membership in the European Union, at that time to the Greek presidency of the Council of the EU in April 1994, with a historic dimension, it seems, seen from today's point of view. It is not my ambition to offer you a comprehensive depiction of the state of play or the way forward for the European Union. We are going to listen to their respective takes on the subject by our guest speakers. But let me, however, draw your attention to some of the key features of the debate on the European Union as we see them from the vantage point of the foreign ministry. So, ladies and gentlemen, less than a month ago, the Commission's President, Jean-Claude Juncker, in his State of the Union address, said that our Union is not in a great shape. And it would be very difficult to argue with this premise. Whether it is the economic front in the aftermath of the crisis and the still sluggish growth in the most of the EU, the immigration crisis, the instability in the Union's neighborhood and tensions resulting from it, coupled with the loss of confidence in the EU and its institutions widespread across many member states, we know that we are indeed in trouble. Add to that speculations concerning Grexit or Brexit, and we're not getting any nearer to the satisfactory state of affairs. What does Poland think of these key issues of today? On the economy, the key issue is definitely regaining capacity to generate growth and create jobs, something which today seems obvious and is being repeated as a mantra. First, lowering of the energy costs, in particular compared to our US allies, is a must. The second area worth exploring is liberalizing the sector of services. We should avoid neo-protectionist tendencies in the EU, as in the long term they will hamper our competitiveness. Thirdly, and that is very much work in progress, the European Fund for Strategic Investments, an initiative which is also subject to discussions for many months. Fourthly, definitely from the Polish perspective, the signing of a balanced, though ambitious, transatlantic trade and investment partnership can be a boost to our economies. And finally, the success in turning EU into a knowledge-based economy with thriving cooperation between the worlds of business and academia will be instrumental in this regard. On the foreign policy aspects, and this will be my second point, we need to first of all, be ambitious and be open. We need to speak with one voice. Poland doesn't want to be portrayed, and this is also very important for me to underline, as a single-issue country with an inclusive focus on the eastern flank, as some call it, or the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And we are active in many other fields, and we try to prove that actively. Nevertheless, we worried about Ukraine, the Ukraine fatigue syndrome that one can perceive in some of the EU's quarters. Despite the gravity of challenges emanating from the south, we as the EU need to remain committed to helping Ukraine. In the months to come, Poland will be actively following the debate on the European global strategy, due to be presented by the High Representative Mogherini in June next year. And I will not miss this opportunity to assure you that Poland is and will continue to be among the champions of the further EU's enlargement, because we think that the open door policy still matters. On the immigration challenges, Poland has proved that it is a responsible country acting in the spirit of our European solidarity. Migration of third country nationals requires the adoption of an overall vision and a complex, consistent, and a long-term approach. Relocation may constitute one of its elements, but it cannot solve the existing problems. We are critical of putting into question the very principles of the Schengen Agreement in the context of a spike in the migration wave and putting up fences within the Schengen area. Sacrificing Schengen, the concept of Europe with no internal borders, which is the real breakthrough in putting into effect an unconstrained flow of people, would be an unacceptable price. On the need for greater legitimacy of the EU, again a subject broadly discussed these days in Europe, we are among those insisting on greater cooperation among national parliaments on EU matters and their greater input into the EU decision-making process. However, this fine-tuning of the role of the national parliaments should occur within the existing treaty regime and without distorting the existing institutional equilibrium. Perhaps we should be more bold and innovative in involving European citizens directly, also by using to a greater degree the potential of the internet and of the social media. The experience of the European Citizens Initiative has so far been rather disappointing in that regard. On the Grexit. After the summer, the speculations have been shelved, hopefully for good. And we have every reason to wish success to the Greek government in its reform efforts. Poland has no interest in experiencing political and economic turbulences, which would be inevitable in the case of Greece leaving the EU. On the UK, another important issue, and its place in the EU. The Brexit debate is definitely a fascinating and fundamental one, also from our point of view. To put it bluntly, the European club without the UK would be a totally different and definitely a less attractive one for Poland. And I'm looking at the colleague from the British Embassy to notice this correctly. We definitely think UK is part of Europe, and one should not create the impression that, the channel is broader than the Atlantic. It's not. Therefore, avoiding the Brexit scenario is one of our desired objectives, and we work with our British partners as we share many of their designs for reforming the European Union. The Union definitely needs reforms, and we agree on that point. Definitely less red tape, fewer obstacles for businesses, stricter application of the subsidiarity principle by the EU institutions. Here we are on the same page with our British partners. Where we probably differ is in the approach towards changing the EU treaties. As you know, Poland is very critical on that. And we definitely have diverging views on the question of limiting social benefits to intra-EU migrants, which in our view is a clear violation of the single market principle. Having said that, I'm optimistic that a good compromise will be found and that the British people can be convinced and will decide in a referendum, this still unconfirmed but most likely date of it being October next year, that remaining in the EU is a good idea and a good solution for Britain. Better probably than one of a splendid isolation. Finally, and this will be my last point, let me add that Poland will continue to be a non-Eurozone EU member state for the foreseeable future, for the years to come. And we are therefore very sensitive about any ideas of further institutionalizing of the Eurogroup, creating a club within a club, or something one sometimes calls a two-speed Europe. To some extent, the two-speed Europe already exists because the membership in the very Eurozone and the current EMU reforms of the last few years imply great level of economic interconnectedness. But we advise against going too far in this direction. We pledge for inclusiveness of the European project, and we think that the integrity of the EU as such must be preserved. And the inclusiveness of any future EMU reform must remain the clear, strong pillar for further actions. And ladies and gentlemen, in one of his best movies, anyhow, Woody Allen said that life is divided into the horrible and the miserable. I sincerely hope that what we are going to hear from our speakers will prove Alan wrong, and that there is hope for the European continent and for the European integration project. I'm personally convinced, but I'm an optimist by nature, that the resources we have in the EU are sufficient for us to prosper even in a demanding global environment. Either we shall face the future collectively, or we shall slide into irrelevance, each on their own account. Greater level of integration in some areas, and let me mention here only the pressing need for genuine cooperation in the area of common and foreign security policy. A strong global voice of Europe is necessary. But we don't have to create a single European state to begin to thrive. I look forward to the inspiring speeches and the debate, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Madam Minister. Andy, I must say that I've assisted Andy for the last 2 days in a couple of his meetings, and it was very much inspiring, and I'm looking forward to it. The floor is yours.
Let me begin by thanking Vistula University for this invitation and for bringing me in the presence of my younger self here. It's always nice to be reminded you're getting older. And I'd like to thank Bartek for organizing everything that I've done here. I've been in Poland for 3.5 days, and it's convinced me that I was very foolish not to have been here before this trip, so I'm already planning to come back in 6 months. So I heard those boos in the back when I said this was the first trip, so I won't make that mistake again. I'm very privileged to be here with such a distinguished panel. Minister Olekowski was reminding me that we were on a commission together, chaired by Henry Kissinger and Larry Summers, back just after the Iraq War. The task of which was to put the transatlantic relationship back together again, and I think we succeeded in doing this, so that was good work. And Paula has been nice enough to come from London to talk on this subject. Thanks most of all to everybody in the audience for coming, the distinguished colleagues. I was once a policymaker and know how time-consuming it is, and that a state secretary should come and spend time on this, I really appreciate. And most of all, students. Of course, I teach for a living, and I know that you have many things to do other than come to this lecture, which is the kind of thing you do every day all the time. So I really appreciate that. Americans tend to lecture other people about what they should do a lot. I tend to be I intend to be very brief in what I say. I'm going to discuss the way Europeans view Europe, because the way Europeans view Europe influences the way everybody else in the world views Europe, the way Americans view Europe, the way Chinese view Europe. And I want to argue that Europeans might choose to view Europe in a more pragmatic and more realistic way. Now, often when people say Europe should be viewed in a more pragmatic and realistic way, this is a code word for some kind of Euroscepticism, that one should be negative about European integration. I mean exactly the opposite. That in fact, if we view Europe in a pragmatic and realistic way, we'll actually be more positive about Europe. Because I think the general way that Europeans talk about the European Union and Europe generally rests on an ideology of European integration that was built up in the 1950s and basically never changed. An ideology of ever closer union, an ideology of formal centralized institutions, an ideology that argues that Europe needs to keep moving forward or it will fall apart. And this ideology leads them, oddly enough, to be kind of utopian pessimists, that they always want Europe to be moving forward, but they're always criticizing it now. So I intend to offer a much more optimistic view about where Europe is now. And although I'll be critical about certain things, it'll be very selective. And the spirit is meant to be pragmatic. Why pragmatic? Because Europe is a mature political institution. We often talk about the European Union as if it might collapse tomorrow. That if something happens to the euro or if people disagree about migration, the European Union could be gone like that. The European Union has been around longer than most established democracies in the world today. It's been around for over 60 years. It is built into the fabric of European life. You can't do business in Europe. You can't travel in Europe. You can't function legally in Europe. You can't do almost anything in Europe without confronting the European Union. It's here to stay. The question is only precisely what form should it take and how should we talk about European identity. So let me make just 3 points about how Europeans have a kind of idealistic view of European integration and how a more pragmatic view might give them a clearer, perhaps more accurate, and perhaps more optimistic view about where Europe is. So the first point, as I alluded to before, is that many Europeans, particularly those who are the strongest supporters of Europe, tend to be very critical about the current state of Europe. They tend to focus on crises, and they tend to stress why more integration is needed in order to solve the problems that we face. In its extreme form, this takes the form of the so-called bicycle theory. It's not really a theory, but the sort of bicycle conjecture that if Europe doesn't keep moving forward, it will collapse and will fall off the bicycle. Although I agree with almost everything that the State Secretary said, the tone of the speech is very much like this. Here are all the problems we have in Europe, and here are all the things we need to do. But let's just step back and talk for a minute about how successful this organization is. right? This is by far the most successful voluntary international cooperation in world history over this 60-some-odd years. A customs union, the agricultural policy, a wide domain of regulatory norms for industry and economic activity that aren't just dominant in Europe. They're the dominant regulatory norms around the world. In China, the most important source of regulatory norms is Europe. Financial liberalization, the liberalization of border controls, coordination of home and internal affairs, anti-terrorist policies. Externally, you have a remarkable degree of coordination of foreign policy among European states. Most of the policies, almost all of the policies in the United Nations by European states are coordinated. And an enormous coordination of trade policy, development policy, other kinds of economic policy. Now, many people nowadays, faced with things like Ukraine or China or Russia, say, European foreign policy? You know, how can you view that as a success? Or the current state of the economy, how can you view that as a success? But let me just give 3 examples. Number 1, European enlargement. There is no single policy wielded by any country or organization anywhere in the world over the past 25 years that so cost-effectively spreads peace and prosperity as European enlargement. It is utterly unique. The United States has nothing like it. China has nothing like it. I don't need to tell people in Poland the effect of this policy. And it is still being used in places like the Western Balkans, and in an attenuated form, a smaller form, a thinner form, in neighborhood policy in places like Ukraine and Morocco. Second, free markets. We just went through the largest depression since the Great Depression, and there was almost no movement toward trade protection or even financial protection outside of a few countries throughout Europe. Compare that to the 1930s, where you had complete chaos and economic closure within Europe. That's an epochal shift. And finally, Ukraine. So a lot of people think, oh, Ukraine, well, how could that be a success? Consider what Europe has done, right? September 11th was the first day in 18 months when there was no artillery or mortar fire in Ukraine. Basically, we're moving toward a kind of, or appear to be moving toward a kind of informal settlement, or not settlement, but informal compromise in Ukraine. And that compromise is almost entirely based on the exercise of European economic power. Americans had almost nothing to do with it. NATO showed up, flew a few airplanes around, but the power exercised against Russia is the power exercised by European sanctions and the disapproval of Europeans. Europeans trade with Russia 12 times more than the United States. They trade with everybody more than the United States, more with China, more with almost everybody. And it is Europe that is on the front line of this battle, and it is Europe that is prevailing. Mr. Putin can't project power more than a couple of hundred miles off his own border. And Europe has blocked him without ever shooting off a gun. As I said, Europeans tend not to stress these things as successes for the European Union. Instead, they're often portrayed as crises or failures, as areas where Europe needs to do more. They're often presented as areas where Europe is in a crisis and there should be more formal cooperation in Europe. And this is a distinctly European way of speaking about the problem. When Americans do something, even something that's clearly a failure, like the war in Iraq, they go and boast that it's a big success, right? When the Chinese do something that's a total failure, like building a couple of platforms on islands in the South China Sea, they say, look at what we're doing, right? When the Europeans do something, like standing down Mr. Putin in Ukraine, they go, this policy doesn't seem to be working. We're really not sure. What should we do? It's a crisis. And send up a state secretary to talk about it, right? This is not helpful. Not just because it leads European citizens not to have confidence in their own institutions, but because it leads people in Washington and Beijing to wonder, like, what's the matter with these people, right? If you want Americans and Chinese to respect you, tell them that you're powerful. Okay, that's number one. Number two, Europeans tend to be legal formalists. Okay, they tend to think that Europe is successful when it works as a legally integrated institution, and that the only way to solve collective problems is by working formally through institutions. Of course, most people who favor European integration, if you ask them, will deny that they believe in a United States of Europe or ever closer union because it's politically incorrect to admit that. It's just that they've never seen a proposal for formal centralization that they didn't approve of, right? They approve of them all. But in fact, often cooperation in the European Union works better if it is not formally centralized. It works better when Europeans used informal coalitions of the willing. In fact, even the formal institutions of the European Union, as I'm sure the students here have learned in their classes and the practitioners here know from their experience, don't actually work in the way that the formal rules say they should work. European institutions say that there should be qualified majority voting, but there's almost never qualified majority voting. It's usually consensual bargaining of some slippery and complicated, quiet variety. And this is particularly true in an area like foreign policy. So let's take another example, Libya. So you might think intervening in Libya was a wise thing in the long term for Europeans to do. You might think it wasn't a wise thing. But it was something Europeans did want to do. And the Americans didn't want to do it. We weren't interested in intervening in Libya. So Europeans got together and talked about it. And what they found was some countries wanted to intervene in Libya and some didn't. So the countries that did want to intervene in Libya, Britain and France, but not Germany, etc., got together. They convinced the United States to do it. They organized the operation. It cost no more than €1 billion compared to almost $1 trillion that the United States has spent in Iraq and failed. And they got the job done. Almost every headline in European papers said, what a failure for European integration. Because the European governments didn't agree, because the Germans didn't come along, where was the European Council in this discussion? Why don't we have stronger European security cooperation? Is so difficult, right? But you should judge European integration not by the formal perfection of the legal institutions, by what you get, but by what you get done. Again, this is the way the Americans and the Chinese think about it, right? It's what you get done in the world. Or if you want to put it in moral terms, how many lives you save on the ground in Libya. That's what matters. Not whether or not the council signed off on it. And this is a very EU way of thinking about it. And it's unhelpful, both inside of Europe and outside of Europe. And there are many examples one could cite where this kind of flexible cooperation actually works better. Europeans should not be afraid of it. Third example, many Europeans believe that questioning any European policy is to question all of the European project. But remember where we started. European integration has been around for 65 years. It's permanent. It's not going to go anywhere. When polities, when states become established, the debate is no longer, will there be a Poland, or will there be a United States, or will there be an EU? The debate is this a good policy or not? And if not, you get rid of it. Now, the EU has some policies that are not so good as they should be. Now, here's where I'll discuss the kind of things that the State Secretary was talking about, the kind of current crises. So let's look at the EU policies right now. The Ukraine, actually I think that policy is pretty good and it's working pretty well. We have the problem with Britain, British exit. I think the probability of British exit is 0. 0. I mean, it would be crazy for the British to exit. We're viewing the amusing spectacle of the Conservative Party in Britain, the quasi-Eurosceptical party, arguing for staying in the European Union, backed by the left-wing party. And even if there were vote to pull out, then the likely outcome would be to twiddle around with the treaties a little bit and then to ask them to do what the Irish did when they voted against the last treaty amendment. They vote again until they get it right. That's what you always do. And the idea that a pro-business, right-wing British party would pull out of the European Union is, in my view, absurd, and I refuse to think about it. Migration. Migration is a serious issue. It's obvious, just looking at the Polish debate, that this creates real domestic political problems for people in different polities. But I'm not sure that it creates an existential issue for the European Union, because the European Union can survive with different countries having different tolerances for accepting immigrants. The policy I worry about is the euro. Because the euro is basically a bad policy. What do I mean by a bad policy? It's a policy of imposing a single macroeconomic standard on an entire group of countries which do not have the same macroeconomic fundamentals. Economists agree that this is not a good idea, and it is something that imposes intense costs on particular countries, particularly on weaker or debtor economies. This is not a particular economic view. It's everybody's economic view, right? It's the conventional wisdom in economics. We know that once you take away the option to devalue and the option to use an independent monetary policy, the only option left for countries in the south of Europe now is internal deflation, and that many countries, I think most notably Italy, are structurally uncompetitive within this system. So to remain within the euro without forcing policy adjustment on surplus countries or finding a way for it to take place in a less costly form for debtor countries is to simply impose low growth on Europe in perpetuity. And imposing low growth on Europe in perpetuity is a bad idea, not just because growth is the source of all the other good things that society can do, and not just because it creates political weakness and conflict in societies. It's a bad thing because it undermines support for European integration. Look at poll support for European integration over time. For 40 years, continuously, European institutions were more trusted, better liked than national political institutions in almost every state of the European Union. That stopped at one moment, 2008, 2009. Poll support for the European Union the number of people who think they trust European institutions went down from 50% to 10 or 12 or 15%. So sticking with the euro isn't the European policy, it's the policy that undermines Europe. But what stops Europeans from criticizing it? It's this belief that if you criticize just one European policy, the whole edifice will come tumbling down. And that's the idea from the 1950s that Europeans need to get rid of. In Poland, or the United States, or Germany, if one policy is bad, you criticize the policy, you're not calling into question the country. Very different in Europe. So overall, in conclusion, Europe would be a healthier place, a more legitimate place in the eyes of its own citizens, and an easier place to explain to people outside of Europe, in America, in China, and the rest of the world, if its justification, its public justification, were pragmatic and realistic rather than idealistic. If people didn't always say we needed more integration and everything about Europe was in crisis, if people weren't always focusing on legally formalistic solutions to problems, and if they didn't always defend policies, even if they're clearly bad policies. I gave this summary of these remarks to European ambassadors this morning, and they all disagreed with me. And I'm sure you will too. So thank you very much.
Paola, the floor is yours. When I, for the first time, read your publication on international economics, I must say that I thought, wow, that's the way I want to follow. Please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I must say, those who boo me and Andrew before, because we've never been to Poland, they were right. And I'm very delighted to have accepted this invitation and have the opportunity now to close this gap in my extensive traveling and finally have the chance to be in Warsaw. So thank you very much. What I try to do today, I mean, I try to have a very hard act to follow, and a very, very difficult topic is the future of Europe. It's huge and complex. But let me start to say, then, when I say Europe, I mean the European Union. Europe, to me, is a geographical concept. The European Union, it's an institutional concept and a very, very, I would say, different animal from what we have in the current world. It's not, definitely, is not a sovereign state unlike the United States and China. And what I'm going to do today is to give you a sense of where we are and try to look at the future. And I do something that I normally open my course with my students at the University of Bologna. And myself, I'm a citizen of Europe, and I'm from a country, I'm a national of a country which is a founding member of the European Union. And I grew up with the strong belief, because that's what we believe and we strongly felt, then that was the best possible thing. And again, it's a way to preserve peace and social cohesion in Europe. And my country has always been very much in favor of Europe, except then in recent years, the share of Eurosceptic has increased remarkably. But I also live in a country which is a Eurosceptic country. I would say a country which has always been problematic vis-à-vis the European Union, but also a country which has contributed a great deal to the debate inside the European Union. So it's a country which has the gut to say things that other countries do not want to say, you know, what we need to reform and how to be more innovative in policies and our approach to Europe. And I think the turning point for the new European Union is actually 25 years ago. Before, it was just a group of countries getting together and creating this custom union, effectively, or announced custom unions. But 20 years ago, and I do something that I use the Economist coverage to really try to look a bit of the past history and give you a sense how the debate in Europe has changed. I think the Economist does a great job in providing these interesting and provoking covers. And so 1989 was the turning point for Europe, and it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that really changed the dynamics in Europe. And Europe, the European Union, became more ambitious, and it really puts itself into this massive task of creating a single market coupled with a single currency in order to provide and to increase prosperity to everybody in Europe. And at the top of this very ambitious project, there was the project of enlarging Europe to make it bigger. Before it was just a group of Western European countries. So you can imagine with this kind of ambitious project, then if the project doesn't quite deliver, then the expectation immediately or even on the long term tend to decrease and people get a bit angry because they say, well, we had so many expectations. And in fact, this is the cover of The Economist in 1999, where the project of a single currency took off. And that was the moment of great excitement. And it was like a turning point. Again, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, now we have a single market and a single currency. And it was actually, there were obviously countries which were not particularly keen on joining the single currency, but overall there was a big effort, and again, even countries which were not particularly, maybe they didn't have quite the right parameters to become members of the currency union, they wanted to be part of this project. And they wanted because also, and again, I speak as a citizen of one of those countries, because the European Union provided and still provides the kind of discipline, fiscal discipline, and stability against a more dysfunctional domestic policy and politics. And then, again, 2004, you know very well, that was the other big step, and it was the enlargement. And it was another very exciting moment for Europe, where everything was possible. And that was the time where a few years, actually it was a couple of years earlier than 2004, the European Union, the Commission came out with this mega plan of making Europe the most advanced and innovative and richer countries in the world, which was it was a bit of a propaganda, actually, thinking back. But that was it, and it was really good, because that was a promotion of democracy, and this model, again, single market mean married and blinking economic liberalism and democracy. And so that was the key point, and obviously, and then 2005, the Constitution, the European Constitution, another key point. And after that, everything started to go downhill, because if you remember, a few months later, the French and the Danes refused to sign the treaty, and then we got through the global financial crisis, and then the European countries, in particular the Eurozone, after having said very publicly that there was not the case, the Eurozone was safe, there was no problem with European banks, the European banks were absolutely sound, then we know the story. And then at that time, we talk about 2010, we had Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece being in really dire straits, and then Italy was the country that nobody wanted to mention, but it was the country that could bring the whole European monetary union down. And then we started to ask the difficult questions, and I do not entirely agree with Andrew, then we don't ask this question. Actually, we ask them, perhaps in the wrong way, and perhaps in a Eurosceptic and populist tones, but we asked this question. And the first question was, what happens if Greece goes? Can actually Greece leave the monetary union? And is it possible? Is not possible? Which would be the implications? And we are still debating this question because we're not, the crisis is not over in my view. And then we started to debate other possible exits, and the next possible candidate is Britain, which will have a referendum, we don't know yet if next year in 2017. And again, this is another difficult question to ask. So where are we going? So we are on the verge of breaking up this European Union, or are on the verge of making more integrated? And do we have a two-speed Europe? And with actually two tiers, countries that are members of the European Monetary Union, they share the single currency, they share the same monetary policy, and the rest. And what do we do with this monetary union, which I agree with the previous speakers, was not a great idea, but it was a political project, it wasn't an economic project. Unfortunately, the political project underestimated the technicalities behind this monetary union. So where do we go from there? And in particular, can we dismantle? I don't think it is possible. And so, in my view, and this is my sort of future, we have to go down to more integration, at least in the core of the European Union, which is actually formed by the countries which share the same currency. It would be difficult, but I think the only way for Europe to progress and to move on is to stay dynamic. So my hope and somehow fear is that this is a working process. So what we're talking about now is not what we'll see in a few years. But which are the key issues here, in particular in sort of, let's say, economic terms? I said the single market promised this great prosperity. So Europe will be an area where everybody, the income per capita will go up. And in fact, that was a promise also made to new member states in 2004. The gap, the income gap with the richest countries in Western Europe will be eventually closed. It will take some time, but will eventually close. And actually, now people question, and actually we are questioning, the economists like me, questioning whether Europe still has this dynamism, or what need to do to deliver on this promise. And in particularly, if you compare where Europe is now with other countries, and in particularly, I'm thinking Asia, and I'm thinking of China. And so in this graph, in this chart, you can see that Europe, and again, here, I'm not talking about the European Union, but I'm talking about the largest economies and countries in Europe. You can see from this chart, I hope you can see clearly, that the share of the world GDP of each of these big Western European countries, the United Kingdom, Italy, Germany, and France, is actually falling. And while the shares of the world GDP, in particular of a country like China, is expanding. It's the same for the United States. The United States has lost relative weight. But obviously, if you look at the European Union as a whole, that's where we could actually achieve more. So again, I think in even economic terms, we are better together. But this is the core of the problem. It's growth. So the Europe doesn't grow as much as other countries, and particularly countries with similar level of development like the United States. This chart in particular look at the euro area. It's a bit better if you include non-euro countries, but it's not hugely better. So the United States overperform the Europe, and they have been overperforming since before the global financial crisis and after the global financial crisis. So there is something structural in the European economic development that is really hinder these big dream. So again, prosperity from all. And it's becoming even more difficult. Again, this is another way to show the same concept. If you compare, so Europe is not only an area where countries compete with each other, because we have this element, countries compete with each other inside Europe. And I like to stress that 75% of EU trade is intra-EU, so countries really trade with each other. But they also have competition from outside the European Union. So there is a double game here to be played, so increase competitiveness inside the European Union, because there are countries that are lagging behind, and they feel the competition by stronger countries. Again, the previous speakers mentioned countries with a surplus in the current account, so that means they export more inside Europe than they consume, and countries that consume more and they export less. So how we can close this gap inside Europe, and how we can compete with the rest of the world. This is the key issue, and an issue which has kept policymakers and economists busy over the last almost 10 years. And I would say even more, probably from the time of the first Lisbon agenda. There are a lot of recipes. You can, if you believe then it's all a matter of structural reforms, you can really try to intervene on the supply side, create more competitiveness, increase productivity, improve and reform labor market, and make, again, encourage more entrepreneurship and so on. Or you can believe that what needs to be done is more public investment and more demand created through fiscal policies. And Europe has been, fiscal policy has not been working in Europe since the global financial crisis. Or perhaps there is a mix of both, and we need to find a way to improve demand by creating, for example, more investment, and now the plan to increase the investment in infrastructure is a very good step forward. At the same time, helping structural reform. So we have to move to have a plan where we can actually tackle short-term and medium-term lack of growth. And when I say lack of growth, I also mean unemployment in many countries. And this is the fact that people find difficult to get jobs. And there are countries where the unemployment rate is still very high. So we need to tackle the short-term and medium-term problems. At the same time, we need to create an environment that that is stable, sustainable, and is reform. So it's not easy, and it's not easy because there is not a one size fits all. Again, if you look at this figure, you can see Western Europe and is 1.4%, Eastern Europe is 1%. This is actually from the IMF. We can actually play with the numbers a bit more. So Eastern Europe without Russia is higher. Western Europe is 1.4. North America is 3.2. So this is a big divide. And again, the problem with Europe is we haven't tackled this. So we have potentially this great market and potentially this dynamic economy, but we haven't been able to tackle the really key issues to make this Europe work. So where do we go from here? We are as I said, at a turning point, and it's a really difficult moment. And it's a difficult moment because there are no easy solutions, there are no low-hanging fruit. Some of the solutions will be painful, and some will require obviously national governments to take some unpleasant decision. I strongly believe that some countries need to reform their economies, and they need to do it in a way that might upset some of the population. But again, there are long-term gains which can be achieved. But we are stuck. We are stuck because now there is a public opinion which feels that this project has not delivered. And it feels that it's a project of the elite. And you heard many criticisms. And this really is something we need to take into account. And it's something that governments and European institutions need to take into account. The European Union cannot be a project of the elite. People need to be taken on board, and we need to explain why it's better to be together than be apart. And I travel a lot in Asia, and actually Asians are puzzled by the European Union. They don't quite understand why we have this very singular animal, but at the same time, they think it's a great institution, it's a great institutional framework, and they would love to have something similar. So we got it, it's unique, it's unusual, and it's very difficult. It's the first experiment, it's an experiment, it's all learning by doing, and so we need to all work together. And again, think about how was the world or Europe before this great opening. I don't think it was a much better world, and actually would have been much more difficult to travel in Europe as we do now. And to have this exchange of ideas, and we have a whole generation of students, we are in a university here, students who study in other countries in Europe, they move around through this magnificent soft power, which is depletion of, the deploy of soft power, which is the Erasmus program. And we learn from each other. So I think we need to try to keep together and explain and be more clear about the goals of Europe, and most of all, not to be shy, to also see the problems and try to reform them. So the key question we need to ask is whether the European Union is still fit for purpose and when we need to reform. Thank you.
Dr. Olechowski, please.
Good afternoon. It's very rare to be on a panel where I agree with everything that the other panelists said. That's a pleasant part. The bad part is that I should comment on what they have said, and that's pretty difficult. Particularly if you have a foreigner who comes to your country and tells you how beautiful you are. You know, what you're going to say? That you're more beautiful or less beautiful? It's hard to say. I'm a convinced Euro enthusiast. I always was. I remember when I was foreign minister, Javier Solana visited me. He was foreign minister of Spain at that time. And he said, this is 1993, and he said, listen, for countries like yours and mine, European Union is like a box of chocolates. There's nothing bad in it. The only difficult part is how to get to this box of chocolates. And it's a very humiliating exercise. And indeed, negotiations for Spain and Poland were pretty difficult. But once we got there, these chocolates proved to be of the highest possible quality. Good stuff. No milk chocolates whatsoever, just a high-grade chocolate. So I do believe Europe is in a good shape, in fact. I think that 2015 is a good year. Nobody questions European Union existence. Nobody believes it's going to break apart soon. Public opinion, of course, fluctuates, but it's never asked the question, and what if your country were to leave the place? So I think it is a great achievement, and it has a great prospect. Let me, however, address three points where I think a little bit differently than our speakers. Grand ideas. Europe as a pragmatic exercise rather than the ideological or idea-based venture. It's true that continental Europeans are a little bit particular in that respect, that they would like to often refer to Europe idea, to Europe destiny, to Europe vocation, And that is, of course, of the conflict, of this incredible conflict of the Second World War. The concept of make love not war is alien to this part of the world. So you need to refer all the time. You remember Chancellor Merkel was saying that if Euro area will fall apart, we may have another war. And indeed, you see, in times of strain, immediately some resentments are coming back. Immediately, Germans are reminded about the Second World War and so on and so on. So, Mr. Moravcsik, I think some of this is here and will stay with us. Although I speak as the first post-war generation, which has this very much on mind. Perhaps the younger people will be doing it differently and referring to it differently. One perhaps important thing is that every new step in European integration requires hard political work in individual countries. And it's much easier to do that work if there is some big idea behind it, and not just a pure sort of calculation, and it has to be Europe-wide, so it will be consistent throughout the Europe. And it's very important, look at the difference between financial crisis and now the refugee crisis. It's important to have some idea behind, then to have an agreement, and then all the steps, if the crisis comes, are basically technical. Our response to a financial crisis was driven by specialists, by technicians. There was not much politicking in that. Governments were meeting frequently, and after heated discussions, were implementing the decisions on refugees crisis, where we do not have political agreement yet. We don't have a grand design. There was just a single summit and very little of joint action. Okay, my second point is about foreign policy. Indeed, enlargement proved to be fantastic, very powerful tool. We the example of that. It is powerful because it imposes an important discipline on applicant countries. They have to adjust. They have to behave in the way that they will be capable of joining this club. And this club is very attractive, and of course that gives necessary arguments in the domestic debate, how to reform the country, how to prepare, how to reform your foreign policy, how to change your stereotypes, all masses of things. We have went through that. But the trouble is that there are not very many candidates to European Union left. And the trouble is that enlargement is basically the only foreign policy that we have. So that explains why we were so weak, so incompetent in addressing the opportunity that has been created, for example, by the Arab Spring. Europe was unable to respond in a way that could have perhaps encouraged establishment of more democratic, more market-oriented, more conducive to modernization regimes in North Africa. This is the problem that we do not have other tools than enlargement. Is of course paralyzing us in situations such as Middle East conflict and the source of refugee crisis. So quite obviously there is a big work to be done in the area of foreign policy. Europeans were too quick, I think, to use up the so-called peace dividend. It was so tempting and so eager that we gave up on security policy. Of course, we were encouraged by United States, but when United States is now moving away from Europe, and rightly so. It is not the source of danger. It is not the source of threat to United States security. We need to take care of our own security more and more, and we do not have an agreement, and we do not have tools for that. And finally, the third point, which is Euro era. Of course, it is widely criticized, particularly if you read English language text on economist text, and mind you, they are dominant in this era of science. Then idea of Euro era is criticized as a suboptimal solution. So, however, when one think about it, and we know very well that Euro has been introduced also as this final glue that will keep together that otherwise diverge number of countries. However, an economist will tell you what is wrong with an economist will tell you that it is better to take that kind of adjustment. It is more painful, more politically difficult, but it's eventually better in terms of results to take that painful exercise of internal adjustment without the benefit and without the option of using exchange rate. Exchange rate would be sort of manipulation, would be sort of papering out the problem and extending it over a longer period of time, and in fact taking remedies that eventually would be less beneficial to your economy than what you need to do under conditions of the common currency. So I'm not so sure that when we would look eventually at the experience of Spain, Portugal, Greece, and other countries that have been affected by this situation, that future research will say that it was so bad that they didn't have an option of using exchange rate. But all in all, I want to repeat what I said. 2015 is closing as a good year for Europe. Nobody is questioning, for European Union, nobody is questioning its worth and its future. Thank you.
Now let us open the floor to the audience. Questions and answers session. Maybe comments, but comments, please keep it brief. Kasia Pisarska. Do we have a microphone?
I can
Please.
Katarzyna Pisarska, I'm the director of the European Academy of Diplomacy here in Warsaw. Thank you, that was very refreshing. I think I'll sleep better tonight because you don't hear these type of optimistic words very often. And I also have to agree very much. I'm part of a group on the future of Europe that is run by the World Economic Forum in Davos. And we have come to the same conclusions, that the problem is about communicating what Europe is to European citizens and reminding European citizens what kind of entity and what kind of benefits it has brought not only to the continent but to the particular states itself. But what we lack, and this is my question to you, is the details. How do we start this? Because, you know, communicating is one thing, but you need to have elites that communicate this on a national level to its societies, elites that often lack the drive, lack the incentive. Actually, they have this incentive to criticize the EU because that's more popular and that brings them more electoral votes on the national level. You also need a media space, a European media space. How do you create that? How do you do that? What are the major steps actually to start to tell our story? Not to the world, because the world comes to Europe and sees the huge success of the European continent, but to ourselves. Where do we start?
Tom Hashimoto. And you then.
Tom Hashimoto, teacher here and DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford. My question is rather conceptual in the sense that I hear a lot of name of the country when you're talking about the European crisis. And if you look at the economic development index and so on, you're going to see the remaining uneven development within almost every single country inside the European Union. So, in what extent do you think that this conflict between the urban area and the rural area in each country is replaced with the logic of rich country and the poor country? Thank you.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. Santiago with Visegrad Insight. First of all, now that TPP is done, does the US have any excuses to keep stalling the TTIP? Not sure what side that is. And second, Capital Markets Union. Is it possible to have CMU by 2019? Thank you.
Any other questions at this moment? Yes.
Hello, I'm Ruzmat Dior. I'm a student of Vistula University. I have some little comments. To me, Europe is not work properly because I have some disappointment because about Greece, there's still credit. You give the credits, but still don't solve it. Second is Spain. Spain have a problem with banks, and teenagers don't have the works. The third is Ukraine. Ukraine problem, I think you're responsible because you promise the better life. The people believe you and fight to come invite Europe. And what you do, you left it. And their huge problem is, then second, Russia. Russian has sanctions, they will lose 100 millions. It's very bad. And I know the Poland, they lose the, apples. They lose 120 millions. It's very bad. And immigration, about Syria, Libya, they come. And I think it's not properly, it's pragmatic, not for Europe. Sorry, my comments, but I say it. Sorry. That's my
Anaïs Marin, Marie Curie Fellow at Collegium Civitas here in Warsaw. Thank you for very thought-provoking presentations. I have a question for Mr. Moravczyk, Professor Moravczyk. You have been a bit fast on assessing the European policy towards the East as a success. And could you please specify on what grounds you believe we can rejoice ourselves of the situation as it is now in Ukraine? Thank you.
Professor Kuźniar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, I would love to agree with every point Professor Moravczyk said about nice points about European Union, and I'm quite ready to agree with what you said on the European Union inwardly, as a community, space, integration system, etc., etc. While what cannot be denied is that the European Union has lost a lot from its, let's say, international standing as global power, as a global actor. The European Union has lost it during the last few years the capability to influence its direct environment. That is clear. What? Capability to influence to shape its direct environment. I'm talking about to influence, to shape its direct environment. I'm talking about North Africa, Arab Spring, I'm talking about Middle East, I'm talking about Eastern Europe, and the same goes for, let's say, global position of the European Union. I'm sure you remember at the beginning of the previous decade, everybody was talking about Europe, EU as a part of a global triad, which would be the, let's say, the bedrock, geopolitical bedrock for future international order. That's not anymore the case. What we see is obviously something we call Himerica. I mean, the Beijing-Washington axis. And my question to you is, if you agree with this assessment, where is the problem? Where is the problem? Whether it's the hijacking of the European, of foreign and security policy by European powers, or low intensity of integration, or just the bad conjuncture, just bad luck, which would pass away in years to come, and so we can sleep safely and happy, nothing wrong is going on as to our international position, because 10 years ago, even more, everyone was talking about the EU as the global power. That's something which does not exist anymore in the European narrative. So I would like to somehow to refer to this point. Thank you.
I've got 4 more questions on the list and many more, but let me close the list, we don't have much time. Professor Żukrowska, Professor Nowak, Małgosia Bonikowska, and Monika.
Katarzyna Żukrowska, Warsaw School of Economics. To make the long speech short, I don't want to make too much remarks. One to Andrew Moravczyk. I don't think that you are right with evaluation of EMU, generally speaking. I would look at EMU much more as a method which is restructuring the expenditures in Europe, which is reshaping, opening the economy, because it is an old type of policy, type of interventionist policy, which you can conduct when your economy is closed. That's a very short remark. But my question would be relating to this, what was said here on the left about TTIP. I see TTIP as a possibility. You were showing the rates of growth in different parts of the world. I think that the responsibility still lies in the hands of the most developed economies, and this is US and Europe. So TTIP could be a stimulator, and it also could deepen the relations within Europe, as we didn't finish the single European market. So I would look at TTIP first of all as something stimulating America and stimulating Europe, but also a possibility of working afterwards together on a global scene, because this is the responsibility of those countries.
Thank you. Professor Nowak.
I have heard Professor Moravczyk saying that the chances for exit of Britain is close to 0, if I understood well. I would agree really wholeheartedly, but what comes to my mind immediately is this what observers say, the increase of irrationality and emotionality in the present circumstances almost everywhere, including Poland, unfortunately, I would say. Do you take into account also this element which is so difficult to measure?
Just a short comment about Professor Moravczyk comment about pragmatism and realism. I think that it's a question of perception. My feeling is that most of the decisions of the European Union, I mean of the European Council in particular, are in recent years quite realistic and pragmatic. There is not too much about ideology, about ever closer union. The problem is that there's a different understanding of pragmatism and realism at national level. In Poland, for example, I don't know what does it mean, but in other countries it's the same problem. So to have some coherence in decision making, we should have more coherent approach of member states, but it's not possible because of cultural differences, perception, etc. Thank you.
Małgosia Bonikowska.
Center for International Relations. Just 2 questions short. Professor Moravczyk, you said the Eurozone and all these issues is a bad policy. I'm here. Yeah. If it's a bad policy, I just wanted to understand your position. It's something we should work on and correct it, or your position would be just to give it up? That's question number one. And number two is the EU had a lot of positive consequences, the project. But the paradox is that in the same time the EU started to be seen as an umbrella in the continent, there are also some separatisms which came to the scene, like we had a referendum in Scotland. No was prevailed, but still the issue is there, right? We just have now facing the problem in Catalonia, in Spain. So I just wonder to both of you, how do you see the process? How do you see the future of these kind of arguments where they say, why should we stay in Spain or in the United Kingdom if we have a united Europe?
And the last question, Monika Bartoszewicz.
Monika Gabriela Bartoszewicz, lecturer here at the university. Thank you very much for your comments. Just a short follow-up on the last question. I like the inspiring call for pragmatism when we think about the European Union, but I wondered whether what we heard does not remain in the realm of magical realism more than this pragmatism that was advocated by Professor Moravcsik. And particularly, I would like you to offer some comments on what is happening now in the EU when you think about it as an elite-driven and invented project, now being rejected by the societies of Europe. We can see the surge of anti-EU parties, not only in the UK, but also in Western Europe, but some of the countries on the south also follow the suit, not only Greece, but also northern Italy. Perhaps you can say something more about it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Okay, I will be very short. I understand that scholars are very important people, but also students also should have vote. Okay, I have also a few questions. We talked about future Europe, but most of you talked about just how it was great that we created European Union. It was a very big success, but nobody didn't mention about what is the future of Europe in recent 10 years, 15 years, or something like that. And Europe lose position everywhere nowadays because even England want to escape from European Union. They lose position in Middle East, everywhere, and even they can't resolve the problems of refugees. Okay, and now what about the strategy of European Union to maintain the leadership in the continent, and what about how to show that yes, we are in power and we can lead and also lead the world, and that's all.
Let us come back to the panel, and I must say that please answer the questions and also include the final word as we are approaching the inauguration ceremony faster and faster. Andy, please.
Well, thank you for all the interesting questions. I can't answer them all. Nobody can answer them all. But here are a few thoughts. First of all, about the EU being an elite-driven project, it's not a problem for the EU to be an elite-driven project most of the time, because most of the things the EU does, nobody cares about. What happened in the last decade or so is the EU took up two issues that people do care about. One is macroeconomic management, the euro. The other is now migration. And these are issues that actually move large numbers of voters, which never was true in the EU before. The problem with the macroeconomic management is it's badly done, and it's not by chance that you see these opposition parties in places like Greece and Italy. Migration, my guess is that those groups are going to be successful, relatively successful at opposing things, which is why countries are going to reach country-specific compromises and then work them out, which is what I predicted before. As to the solution on the euro, The best solution would have been in the past, maybe about 2 years ago, which would have been to give up the euro for the southern countries. If I were the head of Italy, which fortunately I'm not, I would have the courage that Gerhard Schröder had in Germany, for which he's much praised today, which is I would take a difficult political decision to rationalize the macroeconomic policy of my country, in his case, labor markets and so on, which of course cost him his job. If Matteo Renzi had guts, he would pull out of the euro, which would cost him his job, but would clarify the macroeconomic situation of Italy. But that probably will not happen, because politicians are short-term electoral maximizers. And so the likely outcome in Europe is that they will muddle through doing the short-term advantageous thing as politicians rather than the long-term beneficial thing. And this is ironic, because the original justification for the euro was it will be painful in the short term to adjust to it, but in the long term it has benefits. Now the justification for the euro is we can't think of any reason why this is a good long-term policy. We know it was stupid. Everybody in the room has basically admitted that, but in the short term it's too expensive to get out of. That's not a good political situation to be in. It's, and that speaks to the issue about the purposes of the, I think right here, about the purposes of economic and monetary union. Of course, this is quite correct. The project of economic and monetary union was predicated on the assumption that economic and monetary union, either the threat of its future imposition or its functioning, would be enough to force convergence of European economies such that they would become the optimal currency area that they are not. The problem is, this didn't happen. And it is not happening now for most countries. And the result of that is people need to adjust to the fact that this has not happened. And pretending as if it's not the case is not a solution to the problem. Now, as to the question of Europe, somebody asked here about Europe's failures internationally, the Arab Spring, Eastern Europe, its global position vis-a-vis China. Okay, let's take these one by one. Arab Spring, look, nobody can manage reform, domestic reform, in North Africa and the Middle East. The United States has been trying. I think we've spent at last estimate $2.5 trillion US dollars to try to do this. We've intervened with troops. In other cases, we haven't done anything. In other cases, we've let the Europeans do it. In other cases, we've intervened covertly. And in every case, it hasn't worked, right? So this is not a tractable problem. And you can't blame the Europeans for not solving it. But you can say that they did pretty well at trying to manage the things they tried to do. Eastern Europe, I see pretty much as a success. Now, is Ukraine going to come out well in the long term? Again, you can't control Mr. Putin. He might go completely crazy and do something, what one analyst referred to yesterday as completely insane. But barring that, what we're basically seeing is increasing quiet on the Eastern Front in Ukraine, Russian feelers about making some kind of a deal, and analysts in the United States, analysts in Germany, analysts here in Poland are starting to say we're looking for an informal settlement in Ukraine, and that's largely due to European activity. On China, I think China is the most overrated country in the world. It is militarily weaker, economically weaker, and certainly ideologically weaker than people give it credit for. I just gave a presentation about this, and I could put up, a half an hour of slides to support this view, but actually it's a view supported by almost all the people that are serious analysts of China today, David Schaumburg, and so on in the West, and most Chinese. I recently spent a year living in China, and most Chinese analysts don't pretend as if their country is anything but a developing country that has a long way to go before it can compete with the major superpowers in the world, which are the United States and Europe. So I simply don't agree that the China has taken over from Europe. I do agree, however, that there is a perception that it has taken over. And that is the issue that I'm trying to address. Now, that speaks to the first question that was raised. How do you change perceptions? So I'm saying that these perceptions are factually incorrect. Now, the person that asked the question said, well, but it's so tempting for people to blame the EU. Okay, I don't blame people who blame the EU, because there's nothing you can do about Eurosceptics and opponents and things like that. I blame the friends of the EU, because I think the friends of the EU set the tone for how we talk about the EU. I'll tell you a story. I was in a seminar room at Princeton, and we had a delegation from the European Parliament. The delegation consisted of a lot of people, including a British Eurosceptic and an Italian Euro enthusiast. So the British Eurosceptic said, the European Union is taking over Europe. It's a socialist conspiracy. It has millions of bureaucrats in Brussels. It spends all this money. All these things that are completely, of course, crazy. Brussels has 20,000 bureaucrats, probably fewer than Warsaw. And I mean, it was insane. So I calmly said, well, this is factually incorrect, la-di-da-di-da. The Italian jumps up and says, what are you talking about? You're an Anglo-Saxon professor. You understand nothing of Europe, she said. Nothing of Europe. We are trying to create a state here in Europe, a super state. And so, and then the British Eurosceptic says, you see, that's what they're trying to do. It is the friends of Europe that set the tone for how Europe is debated. And we need to change the language, starting with the people who support Europe. They need to be rigorously pragmatic in how they sell the project. And the more they do that to set the tone, but at the same time, rigorously optimistic. And the more they do that, the more they can set the tone for everybody else in the debate.
Thank you. I try to bundle together most questions and try to sort of give a general answer. First of all, let me say I totally disagree with Professor Morov, because I think the euro area, the eurozone, the monetary union cannot be or not be dismantled easily. So a pragmatic solution doesn't contemplate taking countries out of the eurozone. For the simple reason we don't have a solution from an economic and financial point of view. So I think we go for more integration. And again, the banking union and the capital markets union is actually the way forward because that's what is needed. And so it will be difficult, it will be complicated, but it will happen. I think there was some question about, again, the income gap, the convergence, and the various crises in Europe. I think the point here is not the macro picture, which could be very positive, but how we need to look at the distributional effect of some of this prosperity. I totally agree with the professor who mentioned TTP. Yes, of course, TTP should really boost growth in Europe, but the most important about how and which countries will benefit. And this really is very important to understand, and the countries in the European Union are not all the same. And back to the point about the income gap and the example of urban versus rural areas and translating to rich and poor countries. I think part of the sugar pill, which was proposed at the time of the enlargement, was this idea that magically all countries should converge eventually towards this level of income, which is the level of income of the most advanced and richest country in Europe. This is not possible. We can't ask Greece to become Germany for the simple reason that Greece has a completely different set of endowment and factors, and there are a lot of different reasons for which Greece is not Germany. So Now, we need to be very, very aware of this and say that everybody and every country can converge and can benefit from this globalization of this integration is not right. And then back to your point about how we tell the story, I think we need to tell the story, which is not a sugar pill. We need to be aware that there are people who gain, a lot of people gain, and people who actually lose. And there are people who have lost in this game, in particular in countries in the European Monetary Union, because the adjustment process which is required to compete, to live, as we say, with the euro and within the euro, is painful. And in fact, back to various questions about, again, populist party and also separatist party, I think we need to draw a line from Catalonia and Scotland, where there are national identities there, from Europe, from, say, Lombardy and other countries. In Italy, for example, Eurosceptics are anti-euro. And if you look at the composition of people who are Eurosceptics, are those who lose out in this game. So now, the thing to do, instead of telling the story, we will all be very happy together, we need to say, yes, of course, we need to recognize that there are costs and benefits in this experiment, and there are people who are left behind. That explains, again, why the same people are so much against immigration, because in this single market with free movement of goods and people and capital, those with high skills and able to move around gain. Those without those skills lose. And obviously they are in direct competition with people from other countries within the European Union with a different and a lower wage structure. And they get completely, and that explains why we have this kind of reaction. So we need to understand, and so we need to really and do something about it. So there are adjustment processes that can be put together and help those who are left behind. This is actually as part of being a fair society and really buy people into this project, because otherwise we will lose everybody or all those who feel that they are on the wrong side of globalization. I think that's that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this. Thank you, our distinguished speakers. For those who are coming to the ceremony of inauguration, the Aula 4 is next to this. Thank you so much for everything. You get the flowers after the ceremony. We are now